I found this turbo randomly as I was moving, and it just reminded me all the memories I had with my first turbo rebuild. So I wanted to go through and tell you about all the experiences of my first turbo rebuild and all the obstacles I went through, so that it will make it much easier when you go to do your first turbo rebuild. First, before you even start, you want to check and diagnose why this turbo has a problem. You're going to check it for side-to-side shaft play and in and out shaft play. This one has a thrust bearing failure. Because of that, we know that there could have been a couple reasons why it has a thrust bearing failure. One, most commonly, could be oil contamination problem clogging up the thrust bearing, this piece, which blocks off the oil pressure to the thrust bearing. The other thing that it could be, if they just used, or whoever rebuilt it, if that was a rebuilt turbo, is that they could have used a weak quality thrust bearing. This is the best quality one that you can get. The OEM would be second best to this, I guess you can say, and then the other ones are just terrible. So the ones that are really bad are the ones that are completely steel thrust bearings. Then the second worst would be the ones that are, they look like this, but they're not machined from copper bar. They're like, I think they're like a cast material. They're called powder bearings. First off, if you had a contamination issue, a lot of times it would have scarring right here on the shaft where the bearings ride. There's no real way to determine if you can reuse that shaft or not. So if it's scarred, I always say with in doubt, throw it out. Use a new one, because it's going to be a lot cheaper for you to not have to take the turbo back off and reinstall it again and rebuild it again for a second time. You may as well just replace the part for the first time. When I did my first rebuild, this is a common problem that I didn't realize what was going on until later in other rebuilds that I did. So the rear seal goes right here, but if you notice that we have some wear here where it's like this is lower than this right there, that means that you have some wear there where it got mushed up against the bearing housing, and this will be folded over often, which will make this rear seal lock up on that shaft a little bit when you assemble it, so it could not spin freely when you go to put it together. You see it's getting more square as I turn it, but on this other side it's got that area where it's wore out and it mushed up, and that just causes problems. So when I went to do the rebuild my first time, I put that seal on there, put it together, and it wasn't spinning freely. So then I thought to myself, well, maybe the rear seal goes right there. So then I put the rear seal there, and if you do that and put it inside the bearing housing, it's very hard to get that shaft back out without destroying the bearing housing and the shaft. There is a way that you can do that safely, and I realized that because one of my employees had put it together like that. And he was only here for a couple days, and I guess I didn't really give him I didn't really teach him well enough yet. So if you do stick it right there and you put it in, the way to go about taking that off is it will be locked inside the bearing housing. You'll have to put this bearing housing in a press and have the shaft or the press be pressing on this, and you don't press it out, but you just hold tension on there. Then you're going to take a socket or a wrench, and you're just going to wind this off, and if it starts to lock up, wind it out the other way. This just makes sure that the seal is coming off smoothly as you have the press to where it's pressed, holding it in position. That's one way that you can get that seal out. Now, when I was, this is when I was like 17 and I was doing the rebuild. 27 now, almost 28. So what I did was I hit that shaft out with a hammer and just ruined the shaft. I tried to reuse it at the time to just see if it would still work, and the turbo just wouldn't boost at all. It went together and everything, but it just didn't do anything. Like, it just felt like there wasn't a turbo in the car. So then I took the shaft out and took the whole turbo apart and realized that the thrust bearing was going bad. That's very common. If your turbo is out of balance, the thrust bearing will go bad. and of course the shaft was bent. So the next thing that I didn't really pay attention to or didn't really know anything about, this is 10 years ago, was that this piece needs to be ground, but only if you're using the upgraded rebuild kits. The upgraded rebuild kits use a thicker thrust washer. This is for high boost applications. That's also if you're using a bigger compressor wheel. So if you want to run over 20 pounds, it's a good idea to have this thrust washer in there. See, it sits really close to the bearing housing there. Depending on where the center is, it will usually rub up against the top of this. Sometimes you're okay, but not always. So you have to take a porting tool or Dremel tool and cut that. What I do is I just put it on my lathe, and I have a carbide insert indexable that I just cut that out, and it cuts a perfect circle there. A couple other problems I had when I was doing a rebuild. This is later, or maybe before this turbo rebuild that I'm talking about. The first time I attempted to do a rebuild, but it just wouldn't go together. This bearing housing is machined for an Evo 316G, so this is wider, and then the 14B sits much closer here. That's just made to be close to the compressor wheel. So if you go with a bigger compressor wheel, I was trying to put a 16G wheel onto a 14B bearing housing. This area has to be machined bigger for the compressor wheel. We call this the compressor wheel pocket. The next thing that I ran into was the 14Bs have a flat back plate, and there's a thrust collar to match. So the thrust collar is this piece. So this is what it looks like if you put a super back collar inside of a flat back plate. The collar doesn't come close enough to touch the compressor wheel, which means that the turbo is going to lock up. Now, this is the way it should look. This is a super back plate. That's exactly where it's supposed to sit, above, just a little bit. Now, if you put a flat back collar inside of a super back, it's going to be a lot taller, so the compressor wheel is going to be much higher than it's supposed to be, which means it won't go together correctly because the compressor wheel will be hitting the housing. If you do that, then the front seal will be out of this area where it's supposed to seal, so you'll have other problems too. But it won't really matter because the turbo will never go together correctly that way anyway. I had somebody completely damage up a compressor wheel when they did that. The biggest challenge for people that are new at this is getting this snap ring off. I always tell people you can easily get these off with a set of needle nose pliers, but see, they often have that issue where one side isn't coming out at all. The way to free that up is you just take the screwdriver and a hammer and just give it a tap. Then you just take the pliers back to it, and sometimes, well, usually it'll come out pretty easy. Now putting it back in is just the same procedure. These are the pliers that I'm using. These cost me about $1.97 at Walmart, and then I ground them down on the tips so that they'll fit in the holes easy. You could also use these 90-degree ones, and then we grind those down. But these never seem to work because they always bend the tips. The advantage to these, though, is that they have the teeth, so they have a good grip on the C-clip. Make sure you always pry it back, the back side, because it can come back out if you don't. If you need any help with your first turbo rebuild, mention below in the comment section what you need help with, and I'll make a video on that topic.